Sometimes children in our church groups display really challenging behaviour. As a volunteer or children's worker, you might think, what am I supposed to do here? Should I crack down on this or ignore it? I'm not their parent and this isn't school, and I have an inkling that maybe the more authoritarian way Sunday school was run when I was a child isn't quite what's expected here. But I don't want to scare them off. It's so good that these children are coming to my church, but equally my team of volunteers are feeling challenged. We're all a bit stressed, and maybe this isn't all that safe or fun for the child or the others in the group. What do I do? You are not alone. Today we're looking at how do we help children in our groups feel safe and loved? How do we facilitate engagement and safety? I'm Melanie Cave, and today I'm chatting to Lisa Campbell, a special educational needs coordinator with loads of wisdom on this topic. We'll explore challenging behaviour as communication. What is trauma and what is trauma-informed children's ministry? What can we do so that this isn't just yet more work and another thing to remember, but something that works for everyone and really reflects the values of how Jesus cares for us? There is loads of practical content and ideas in this episode, and it's pretty jargon-free, so you don't need to be an education specialist to understand this. I know you'll feel seen and understood. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Hello, Lisa. Welcome to the Roots for Churches podcast.
Hi, Melanie. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm so glad you could join us. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and why you're passionate about children's ministry and trauma-informed ministry?
Yeah, so I currently am leading something called Wonderful Me, which is all about well-being with Jesus at the centre for all ages, but then also really digging into helping churches to create safe spaces that enable every child to feel seen and heard, valued, and kind of flourish in their knowledge that they're loved by God. So my background was in education. I was a Senko for a few years. I've done it in primary schools and secondary schools. And alongside all of that, always done lots in youth and children's ministry in lots of different spaces. And I guess in a kind of job space, in a school space, just increasingly, as I'm sure if you know any teachers will hear this a lot at the minute, just feeling increasingly frustrated with the system, but also just really encouraged that like our churches are spaces of hope. There's so much potential for our churches to be safe spaces and create opportunities for healing. And so I guess just as the children that I was journeying with, just increasingly seeing challenge and difficulty and families that were struggling, just increasingly thinking, well, as a church, we just bring so much hope into this space if we do it well. And I guess I'd started to see some kind of little bits of knowledge and understanding developing in schools that I was working in, but just maybe not seeing so much of that trickling into the church. So Wonderful Me came out of that, really, just a real kind of hope and desire and passion to do better, to do well in our churches, that we create safe spaces for children that are struggling.
It's really helpful. So you're on the cusp of all the sort of leading research and innovation around helping children really engage and be fully themselves in a school setting, but transferring that into a church environment.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
And I think there's so much that's come out recently. So I guess we just are really on the kind of crest of a wave of this like new knowledge and understanding that's just really starting to flourish and trickle in. Mostly because of changes in technology. So things like MRI scans, that has just made such a massive difference to the way that we understand how we work, how our biology works, how we're kind of integrated beings, how we all link together. I mean, it's all God stuff. It's all spiritual. It's all like biblical stuff. And what I guess I love about the kind of new learning that we're bringing in the brain is just what we are better able to do now is understand kind of ancient truths and wisdoms that's always been there in scripture. We just kind of understand why a little bit more now, as we kind of have been able to understand how our brains work. So I guess it's just how do we take some of that learning that in many ways is kind of up here still in the hands of scientists and neuroscientists and therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists, but there's rich learning in that, and we don't need to be therapists or psychologists to make the most of that learning. So I guess I'm kind of the Senko role is kind of jack of all trades and master of none. And you kind of sit in between kind of the specialists and the children. and make that link of how do we take the most of that specialist knowledge and make it really useful. So I guess I'm trying to do that in a church space. How do we take this rich learning and how do we make it practical and usable by kind of people that are grassroots working day in, day out with children, so that we do that well, so that we create opportunities for healing.
That is such a gift. I know that so many of us just want somebody to take all that wisdom out there and make it bite-sized so that we can just go and do it. So thank you for being a Senko to all of us and equipping us. And I hope this conversation really, really helps people, because I think we started with this idea of behaviour management, that quite often we have children who come along to our church and we just don't know how to help. And the first sort of signs of it might be that their behaviour is really challenging. And it might not be sort of initially like running around the room screaming or hitting people. It might be, but it might just be that they're really not engaging, or they don't reply to you or respond to you the way you expect. They don't cooperate with the group in the same way. Maybe they're hiding under a table, or maybe they're just opting out. I mean, it's great that they do turn up at church, but I think for some of us who are children's leaders, we're not Senkos and maybe not even trained teachers. And so our eyes go a little bit wide and we think, I desperately want this kid to love church, to engage, to find this fun, but this doesn't feel safe, or are they even getting anything out of this? And then if you've got any sort of supervision role, you're thinking, my volunteers are getting a bit spooked. My volunteers are like, I don't know what to do here. And we desperately don't. Volunteers are so precious. We don't want our volunteers to think this is too hard. So, say you've got some Sunday school teacher, junior church leader who comes and goes, okay, I've got some really challenging behaviour. What advice do you have, Lisa?
Feels like such a massive amount of stuff that you packed into that, Melanie.
Massive question.
Let's see if we can find a kind of route in. So I guess for me, a real kind of key understanding is thinking about behaviour as communication. So I think if we can look at behaviour and really think what is happening, what is really going on for a child, that means that this is how they're presenting. It may be that they're just actually really bored. And so just to kind of not really engage because they're a bit bored, in which case, we maybe need to think about what we're doing, how we're doing it, what's going on. But looking at that kind of behaviour as communication is just really, really key, because I've read a really great quote online recently that said, thinking of a child as behaving badly disposes you to think punishment, but thinking of a child as struggling to handle something difficult, and it encourages you to help them through their distress. So I guess it's how do we, in those moments where things are not quite going the way that we hope or the way that feels easiest, how do we take a pause moment and just take a breath and just ask God, what is going on here? What is trying to be communicated to me through this behaviour? Because our kids are not always good at their words. Their kind of brains are still developing. They sometimes don't have the language that they need to be able to tell us what is going on for them. But that is going to kind of come out of their bodies. Their bodies are going to tell us what is happening for them. And so just having that moment to think. I think we often think, and we often talk about children being difficult to engage. But actually, I had a really good talk recently who said, can we flip? And instead of it being a child that's difficult to engage, can we think of it as people are journeying with those children who are a bit stuck? Can we think about our own stuckness? I'm struggling to understand what is going on for this child, rather than a child is difficult to engage. So it's how do we take that break? How do we take some of the responsibility and go, what is actually going on? And actually, in church children's ministry, I genuinely don't know how people do children's ministry who don't know Jesus and journey with Jesus, because I think we sometimes forget that we all have this kind of, I call it a bit of a superpower of just the Holy Spirit that can really talk to us and kind of reveal to us what's going on for a child. So in that moment where it's all going a bit crazy, can we pause and can we just do a quick arrow prayer or whatever it is and say, God, can you just give me your insight? Just what is happening? So I think just thinking about behaviour as communication is a really good start to start thinking about what's going on. And then the more we reflect on that, we can start thinking about what strategies are helpful, what might help. So yeah, I think firstly thinking of communication, behaviour as communication, but I think secondly also being kind to ourselves and noticing what's going on for us, because actually when a child is acting out, or when there is a behaviour difficulty or a situation that's challenging within the children's ministry, we might get angry or cross. I think if we paused a moment and reflected on that, mostly we would recognise that what's happening in those spaces is it pushes our buttons of insecurity. And what's really bubbling up in us is not frustration with the child, but actually fear that we don't know what we're doing. You know, I'm not good enough to deal with this. This is not my situation. So just kind of noticing that that is a normal response in us and seeing that for what it is, and then going, but you know what? This is just about journeying with a child that's struggling right now. And through God's power, I can do that really well. And so just noticing that it's normal to have those feelings. But if we kind of stay in that space and then react to it, we're often bringing fear responses, and then operating out of a place of fear is often not helpful.
Yeah, well, you got two reactive people and clashing, you know, and can we be the adult and back off a little bit and go, it's okay. Yeah. Like, I don't know everything here, but I'm going to be present in this situation. And as you say, if we can take a little bit of that responsibility of saying, I'm stuck with how to help you, I can change me. I can't change a child. I might be able to facilitate a different sort of emotional space, but I can't change them, and probably not going to change them even if they come once a week. So it's trying to create that place where I feel okay, as you say, as a leader, that I can find help and I can get unstuck. So that's really helpful. So
yeah, and I think also we might not be able to change a child, but what we can do is change a situation around a child if we can understand what's going on. Yeah, that means they don't get into a space where they're so distracted.
Yeah, so we can set the environment and make it feel a bit safer for them. So why, give me some more on this behaviour as communication. Why are children behaving? Why are they communicating loudly that they're not okay, as it were? Or why are they communicating with their bodies that this situation is overwhelming and I don't want to be here? What's behind that? Because we can see it and go, okay, this is communication. But some of us may not, besides boredom, which all of us will recognise. When I'm a bit bored, I get a bit naughty. But, you know, what other reasoning is there for a child to be kicking off like that, as it were?
Yeah, so I think there's a whole range. So I guess that straight off that, a good thing to do is to be really thinking about, do we know our children? What do we know about them? How can we have good relationships with families? That means that we get a greater insight to the kind of background that's going on for a child. So, and I guess, you know, journeying well with children, that's the heart of it, isn't it? Is knowing your children and learning your children and understanding what's going on. I think it can be really easy when we're doing something week in, week out. I mean, it happens in teaching all the time. When we stand in a teaching space and feel like our job is to deliver this curriculum, then that's what our focus is. But actually, if we can flip it and see our role as journeying with children and getting to know them, and as we do that, we're going to discover all this lovely stuff. You know, whatever we're teaching, be it an English lesson or be it in our churches, we want to discover more of God's love. If we can do it witness, if we can journey with children rather than doing something to them, then as we do that, we understand better what's going on for them, and we understand how to communicate. So there can be loads of things going on. I guess right now, currently, I don't think we can ignore COVID to jump straight into that. I think COVID has done a number on our children in a way that I don't think we are yet fully understanding. I think that is still coming out. I think there were some real obvious things, weren't there, with COVID? So I was working in a school at the time, so it was noticeable that the number of children in reception that were coming in nappies was hugely different than it had been pre-COVID because life had been chaotic. They hadn't had those same developmental checks, those kind of things. That was a real noticeable thing. But actually, beyond the noticeable, I think we had children who were maybe at the stage where they were learning, they were playing on their own and learning to play alongside, or children that were playing alongside and learning to play with, and all of those social skills that would naturally develop normally just weren't able to, because ultimately what we had were children that were isolated in tiny family groups without other children their age. So those social skills were just not the same, or children who were kind of learning kind of sensory processing and being in a kind of busier environment gradually, who were just in very quiet, contained spaces, who just aren't used to that noise and chaos. So I think we've got a lot more children who are just really struggling with kind of sensory overwhelm. And we've also got children who have autism or ADHD or neurodiversity in some other way, who are just, that is the way their brains work. So there's a whole range of things that can be going on for our children. And I think if we want to journey well with them, then it's kind of how do we get to know how each child that we're journeying with is fearfully and wonderfully made, because they're each fearfully and wonderfully made in their own unique way, because that's the, amazingness of God's beautiful creation. In some ways, wouldn't it be easier to just kind of have a nice compliant group if everyone was exactly the same? But we celebrate and just rejoice in God's diversity and beauty of his creation. And the kind of outworking of that in our kids groups means if we've got 30 children, we've got 30 individual creations who are each fearfully and wonderfully made. So they're all going to think differently and they're all going to respond differently, and their bodies are going to be slightly different in how they understand kind of external stimuli and kind of sensory input, all of that stuff. So the more we can get to know our kids, the better we're going to give a good kind of journeying response.
I think one of the challenges churches have is that it's not school. So you don't have the same teacher every day. I'm thinking about dropping off a child at reception first year of school. If you're lucky, you might have, some schools you don't have much contact with the teacher, or they're behind the gate and the kids run in. But sometimes you can have a word with the teacher and say, oh, they had a really bad night, or they've been off with a sickness bug, or grandma died, or something like that, so that you're giving the teacher this heads up of this is going on. Sometimes the handover to the volunteers or the children's workers at church is not nearly so personal. The kids are in the main service and say, okay, now the kids are going to go out to their group. Bye. And maybe there's a handover, but it's all in a rush. All the kids are sort of, we're trying to settle them quickly and then dash off. And also the way we do rotas means that the children's volunteers often change. And so, even if your child's school has a job share, there's still a couple of people, and probably a learning support assistant is the same person consistently. Your kids have got a lot of consistency at school, which they don't get at church. So that knowing the kids thing, logistically, I think is quite challenging.
Yeah.
I know when I was a children's leader, I used to try and get my leaders to rota on for 4 weeks and then have sort of 2 months off. And at first they were like, oh my goodness. I'm like, well, no, you're doing the same as 1 in 3, but you do them all in a block. But you see through sort of a bit of content. You also have an opportunity to remember the kids' names because you're seeing them every week, and you get that continuity. And it was a culture shock for the church because that's not how we normally did rotas. But again, I do think that continuity of getting to know people can be really challenging if you're only in with the children occasionally. Are there other tips that you've got of how we can get to know our children better, especially if we're on a volunteer rota?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things. I think one of the things, so this kind of is a conversation that I have a lot. We have a rota, there's no consistency, but actually we are still in this kind of family, this church family, aren't we? And so one of the things I've been really thinking about in my own church, and just with my girls are now 17 and nearly 20, so they're a bit older, but I am very aware in their lives, you just, as brilliant as I think I am very aware that I am not the person to fulfill every need that my kids have. I know there are things that I didn't necessarily talk to my parents about, or and we had a good relationship. They just need other people. It's that kind of proverb, isn't it? Of it takes a village to raise a child. And so I've been thinking in our own church setting, how do I do that for the kids that are in our church family? I know that I really have prayed for God to put in the path of my girls other people that will champion them and will cheer them on. And so my kind of reflection is there's not much beyond praying that I can do about that. But what I can do is be that for other people's kids. So in my church family, so even just in the chat and the coffee break, are we kind of, if we are on the rota, we're not kind of there to just fill a gap. I think most people on those rotas are there because at the heart of it, they just want good things for those children. So we may not be on the rota that week, but are we chatting with the families in our church? Are we having those quick snippets? And actually, those tiny kind of 30-second conversations where a child feels seen by someone makes such a massive difference, because generally, as simple a thing as that is, it doesn't happen. If you watch and sit at a church kind of just over the coffee break, if I look around, there's adults having conversations and there's kids having conversations, and very few adults engage with the children. They'll be chatting with the parents because that's our chat. And so it's, how do we bring this like beautiful intergenerational like chat where we just help kids be seen, and that kind of journeying is such a tiny thing but has such a massive difference. So it may feel like a little thing, and it may feel like you're on the road to once a week, but you actually have a really important part to play in that child's life, like throughout, and you can do that in tiny ways that builds relationship. So I think that's a kind of really simple thing, because we're generally, when we're not on the road to, I would hope, there for our own worship and at church. And so how do we make the most of those little snippets? And then secondly, I think there is something to be said about just doing really good information gathering with parents as they register. So I've got on my website just a really easy form. I think there's sometimes a bit of fear around, not wanting to ask probing questions, and I think there's sometimes a lot of fear from parents that if I divulge this information, then they're not going to put my child in a group. And so I think there's some reflection to do for us in our churches about how we journey well with parents and how we build up trusting relationships, but having conversations that says, how can we mean this is the best time for your kids? Are there things that we can do that will help them engage more? Are there things that we can do that will help them feel safe and place? And so we can kind of do a more formal information gathering, but don't disregard the informal, just those tiny little touch point conversations.
And I think also don't just do the information gathering at the point when the child joins the children's group and never update it. Is it something that you do every year and say, are our records up to date? Has your child had a diagnosis? Are they now allergic to something that we don't know about? Are we still okay to take photos? All of those kind of things. And it can be a form and an email, but it allows that conversation and prompts it. And the parent thinks, oh yeah, I've been doing all this stuff at school about this, and I haven't told church that this is going on, or that we figured this out, or that this really works. And so it just allows that. But I think we're great at doing an initial thing in churches. It ticks all our safeguarding and health and safety boxes, but we need to just stay on top of it.
And make sure a working document.
And make sure our volunteers actually have access to it, not just the key volunteer who's organising all of this or the children's worker. It's like, do the volunteers know this is what's going on in that group? Because they all need to know so that they can really know the children and help them as much as possible. So I think we can get quite uptight about information sharing, and that is good on one level. We don't want to splash things around that are unnecessary, but these people do need to know so they can do a good job. So it's just getting our communication right, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I think also shifting a little bit in our thinking, because I think sometimes we reduce that down to a diagnosis, like for children with additional needs particularly. So is there a diagnosis in place? And actually, I think the diagnosis is like, a long way down the journey. I'm more bothered about learning what makes a child tick, or what's going to do the opposite, what's going to make them feel really unsafe or really uncomfortable or really disengaged. So if we can kind of frame it that way, rather than we need to know if your child has a diagnosis, but actually what we want to know is what's going to make your child really flourish. Like, what is their kind of happy space? What are the things that they love? Even just like, what is it that's their thing now? Is it Pokemon? Whatever it is, because that kind of gives your volunteers like little ins to have conversations over something that's going on for that child. So what is it that makes your child tick, and what is it that is going to be really kind of hindering to your child joining in with this group? And I think if we can bring it down to that level rather than kind of up here at the diagnosis level, then we get much richer information that's more helpful for everyone. But also kind of ongoing learning of our children. If things don't go as well as they could one time, rather than kind of hanging our heads in shame or feeling like we've messed it up, can we actually use those as learning points, and really reflect on those little incidents? Like, we noticed that didn't go well, we noticed that child really, it may be a child that's got sensory difficulties and we did glue and there was glue on their hands and they really didn't cope. Well, actually, let's notice that. Let's make a note of it. Let's make sure other volunteers know, because if that's going to be a real hindrance to a child joining in, then, we can do something other than glue for them. They can use a Pritt stick or they can use stickers. Whatever it is, that means that we can eliminate those. So it's that continual learning opportunity, but like making the most. And I think sometimes when things haven't gone so well, again, it pushes our button. It makes us fearful or it makes us feel inadequate, and we stop there. And actually those moments have like such rich learning opportunities for helping us do things. So can we press into that uncomfortableness? Can we be okay with getting it wrong, because we are going to get it wrong, and that's okay, and then make the most of those moments.
It's quite freeing, thank you. Just start out expecting to get it wrong and then just learn from it.
We're all going to do it several times.
Definitely. So we mentioned this at the beginning, this idea of trauma-informed children's ministry. Now, I can imagine people sort of taking a little in-breath there. Trauma, like that word is a little bit scary. And we might be thinking, oh gosh, do I have children with trauma in my group? Likelihood is yes. But what do we even mean by trauma? And are we encouraging sort of one approach with one set of kids who we have decided or have sort of figured out that this is their thing and this is how they need to be treated, and then a different approach for others? And how do I know where to go? Can you unpack like what is trauma and what is trauma-informed children's ministry?
So I have done like a whole training module on this for CYM's youth ministry.
Can you do it in 1 minute?
I was going to say that was literally like part 1 of 3. So it's quite a big thing to put into a tiny thing.
Sorry.
But I guess the starting point for me in our churches is to recognise that trauma is present. Yes, is in our neighbourhoods, it's in our communities, it's in our streets, it's in our churches. And so that's a really, really important starting point, I think, that we can really understand that. So some of the statistics around trauma are a little bit frightening. So we've got the UK Trauma Council. They estimate that 1 in 3 children are exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event by the time that they're 18. The NSPCC estimate that 7 children in every classroom have experienced a form of abuse by the time that they're 18. Like, those statistics are massive. And then when we add into the mix kind of COVID, that has swept through not just our country but the world, leaving pretty much no one untouched, and recognise the potential trauma of that. I think we are just working with a very different generation of children than we have journeyed with before. Trauma is prevalent. It's not always seen. Children don't come nicely packaged up with like a little label that says that this is what's going on for me, and a lot of trauma is unseen. So I think if we can be aware of the possibility and almost anticipate and expect it, actually the responses and the approaches that we put in place to journey well with children that have experienced trauma are just good practice for everyone, as far as I can say.
And that's
so
good.
It isn't about having to do different things or knowing about it. If we can kind of be aware of what might be challenging or problematic or tricky or triggering for a child that's experienced trauma, and then just put good practice in place, then it means we're actually helping everyone. Like, what I love about some of the trauma kind of responses, approaches, are they just the way that I see Jesus traveling and journeying with people in what we read in the Gospels. It's just a Jesus approach. It's bringing kindness. It's kind of journeying well. It's seeing people. And so I don't think it needs to be a different thing for 17 different children. I think what it means is just putting some really simple, tiny tweaks into the way we do things, because we recognise potential of causing problems for children that have experienced trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And can we just backtrack a little bit and define trauma? Because I'm thinking a parent dying, I don't know, a volcano, an earthquake, I'm thinking disaster. But I also know that like bullying could be considered trauma. So like how?
Yeah, so basically, the thing with trauma is we could look at some things and we could decide, well, that could be traumatic or that could not be traumatic. And so we can kind of come to conclusions and decisions around whether something should be traumatic or not. And actually, it's not about the event itself. So SAMHSA, who are the Substance Abuse and Mental Health, association, organization, something in America at a kind of governmental level, they put together a kind of definition of what they defined as trauma, and also laid out some really good practice things around what a trauma-informed approach looks like. And their kind of definition of trauma is now widely accepted across the world. We draw on it in kind of British kind of political and kind of setting of policies. And so their kind of definition says individual trauma results from an event, a series event, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So basically, they talk about these 3 E's. So it is an event that happens. That can be a big event or a small event, but it's an event that happens, but it doesn't stop at event. And that's kind of key to it. So it's an event that happens. It's then how someone experiences that event. So 2 people could be in the same event, and one person might experience it as traumatic, and one person might just kind of have different ways of approaching the world, different life experience, and for them it would be okay. And so it's how someone experiences that event, and then thirdly, the effect that it has on them. Is that kind of long-lasting effect that affects their kind of development, their understanding of the world. So what we know about trauma is that how someone that can look different, but one of the beautiful things of it is that a kind of mitigating effect for a child in whether an event will be traumatizing or not is whether they have kind of safe caregivers and positive relationships in their lives, which is just kind of a real hope for us, because actually what it says is the more safe, positive relationships that children have in their lives, the kind of more resilient they are, and the less chance they have of something being traumatic when they journey it through. So relationship is just really, really key. But yeah, does that help? That's quite
Very
a
much so.
long-winded explanation.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. I remember listening to some training on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and they were talking about, there's the sort of things that would presuppose a child, say they're an orphan, say that they're in care, say that they've got an alcoholic parent or something. Those sort of things, you think, you're basically saying that your caregivers are not there and are not stable to be able to give you the resilience to get through all these things. But they talked about like famous examples of people. I feel like it was like Winston Churchill or something, but I could be making that up. But like they had like Sunday school teachers or a granny or an auntie who was their person. And that person's stability and love and care was enough to hold them from kind of going off the rails and from making those adverse childhood experiences actually be traumatic. It was like that person managed to sort of hold the emotional space for them to go, okay, I can get through this. This person's okay and I'm okay. So as churches, there's a real gift of being some of those stable, caring, loving, consistent people for children who might not otherwise have it, or where their family's also going through the trauma and is wobbling themselves, that we can hold and through the Holy Spirit, put our arms around and be that security or that safe place. And I long for us as church to be that kind of community. It's not easy. It's really hard work, isn't it? But it can make a huge difference in the lives of children, of young people who then turn into adults and potentially world leaders. It's significant. And so this isn't just a little thing of like, this would be a nice to have in your children's group. This is actually really important for the flourishing of all of us and our future.
Absolutely. And I think even more than that. So we know that, it's one factor of lots. So it's basically an understanding that trauma isn't about an event. It's about how you experience it. And there can be different things that mean people experience it in different ways. And one of those factors is who you in your life, who's standing with you, which can make a difference. But the other beautiful thing about that connection is what we know now from our brains as we have kind of studied them is basically that we are wired for connection. It's how we were made. It's like woven into our DNA. And so it's what helps our brains to develop, like positive interactions with safe caregivers helps our brains to develop. But also what we've learned is this amazing thing called brain plasticity, which for me just has Jesus written all over it. It's like Jesus is woven into the fabric of how our bodies work. Because what we know is that trauma can affect the brain development in a really unhelpful, negative way. It can massively hinder development. We've looked at pictures of children's brains who've experienced trauma and children's brains who haven't, and they physically look different. So that's not the good news. But what we know from this thing called brain plasticity is that damage can be repaired, and it's repaired through positive interaction with safe caregivers. So as we bring this relational approach, as we journey well with children, not only do we join in with kind of standing with them and cheering them on, like that passage in Philippians about the host of people cheering them on, like we get to be part of that crowd of witnesses that cheer our children on and give them strength and hold their arms up when life is tricky. But more than that, we get to stand in when damage has been done, and that relationship can just bring so much healing. And brain plasticity says the brain can change in a positive way, and that damage can be repaired through that relationship. So what we are doing in our kids groups on Sunday might feel like such a tiny thing, like you're on the rota for 1 week a month and you're there for an hour and a half, but the power of that connection when we do it well and when we journey with our children and we help them feel seen and heard is just so massive. And that just is a Jesus thing. Like, you know, we're made to be in connection with each other, with Jesus, and that's what fuels us. It's what brings healing.
Oh, it's exciting. So it's preventative and healing.
Absolutely.
Sign me up. So, okay. So we've got children, potentially a third of the children in our group may have some sort of trauma going on. What approach, we've talked about sort of a shift of approach or a shift of a framework. Can you give us sort of a way into this? What's the approach that we want to use across the board because it's good for everybody, but especially for those children who've experienced trauma?
Yeah, so I think the more we can press into this and the more we can understand it, the better. So if there is trauma-informed training in your area, it's definitely worth onto it. In fact, the course I mentioned before that I wrote for CYM is available online. You could just do it in your own time, and that's a really good course. I'll send you a link as well. But the thing that I always come to whenever I'm asked this question as a starting point is something called PACE. So PACE is a tool that was written by a guy called Dan Hughes. He's a therapist, and he used PACE as an acronym to describe a kind of approach to therapy, a therapeutic approach that he uses in his space. So he is a very well-known and very brilliant psychotherapist. But basically, PACE is an acronym that stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And he describes that as a kind of way of thinking and behaving that aims to help a child feel safe. And ultimately, that is what we want. If children don't feel safe, they are not going to engage with what we're doing. And we know from kind of children that have experienced trauma particularly, but also children with additional needs that have sensory processing difficulties, they are overwhelmed in their senses, they are not going to feel safe. So whether it looks safe to us or not, it's how do we understand that? How do we help a child feel safe in what they're doing? So PACE is a really, really brilliant tool because what it describes is an approach. And I think in our groups, we're often good at talking about kind of what we're doing with our children, but we're not always so good at talking about how. It feels a little bit difficult to define and not quite so tangible. We can talk about a program and say we're going to do our craft, this is going to be the story, this is the game that we're going to play. But how we deliver that is actually what makes all the difference as to how that goes with our group. And so the reason I love PACE is it kind of gives us a bit of a framework on. So it kind of gives us some language to start talking in our teams about what our approach could look like. So are we playful? You know, if a child is struggling, I had a child once in a school setting, not in a church setting, not to freak anyone out, who had climbed onto the roof of the school. Now, my immediate response is definitely one of fear, to think, oh my goodness, what am I going to do to get him down from there? And if he falls, you think of all the things that could happen. So that kind of then pushes my own buttons. And a kind of normal, potentially, response that would be understandable would be to be quite authoritative in the space. And that's not what you're supposed to do. You must come down right now and bring that kind of anger, probably because I'm feeling fearful. But actually, I kind of made it a little bit of a game of how can we find that is the best way down, and can you do that by holding on with, both, whatever it is, make it a game to get him down off the roof, because ultimately what I want is to get him into a place of safety, and then we can talk about whether it was and what was going on that meant he was there in the first place. But that kind of playful approach actually means that kids' defenses are not quite so up.
Yeah.
And if we go into that space with a bit of an authoritative, we just make them feel more afraid, and their defenses come up and they don't really listen.
Yeah.
So
and if he's running away for some reason because he's scared, then you're going to make him more scared, and he's not going to want to come down, is he? So it kind of makes sense once you say it, but you're right. Our default is to be like, come down right now. Like, that's not okay. We need to assert our boundaries. I'm sure he knows the boundary. I'm sure he knows the roof is not on the allowed places.
But I think it does the playfulness. So we always start, when I do training on pace, P is the first word in pace.
Yeah.
So we always start with playfulness. And actually, it sounds like a no-brainer. Like, we're journeying with children. Of course, we are going to be playful. But actually, when you sit with it for a minute, what it does is allow us to notice our kind of inbred default positions. Because I think for a lot of us, if we're honest, our default would not be to bring a playful approach with a behaviour situation, because I think we would feel like, well, I'm not just playing with a naughty child. That's not helpful. Like, I can't, I'm condoning their behaviour by playing with them. But actually, that playful approach can really break down barriers and help us relate much more quickly. That means we can then journey the behaviour and understand it and reflect on it in a much better place. So I think it helps us, and I think we have to be a bit more reflective and notice what is the kind of things that we have been taught, and our kind of inbred understanding of behaviour management, which isn't a term I love. But that kind of, and I think that kind of quite authoritative place is often where we come as a default. So it sounds lovely and it sounds great, but we have to be realistic that we're talking about some really challenging things when we talk about.
Yeah, it's not going to be the first thing that rolls off of our brain as it rolls off the tongue. Oh, let's be fun about this. Yeah, you're right. Our habit, especially if we're scared, is to sort of take control. We're the adult. We need to be responsible. And so this is going to take a bit of work to think differently and to do it. And some people do it more naturally. Some people seem to be big kids at heart, or just seem to get alongside kids and are playful. But others of us will have to learn it and watch other people who do it well.
Yeah. And it's like, it's in all of us. The same child, we had an incident with him the following week, and I was busy. I had a deadline for a report that I was writing. I'd been called on my radio to step in, and I was not regulated myself. I was not calm myself. I was busy, and my kind of default bubbled up, and I went in very like, get out. It did not play out well. Someone else had to come in and support.
And this is why we need
I
team.
haven't approached it well. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've got to say, I'm triggered here. I'm not able to do this. I'm not going to be playful here. Can you take over? Yeah.
And and I think most of us that are journeying with children, we're doing it because it matters, because we're passionate about journeying with children. But we have I grew up, my parents were full-time children's workers. They journeyed with us really, really well. I would not say this was their approach to how they journeyed, but I definitely grew up hearing the phrase children should be seen and not. And like that stuff, whether we agree with it as we hear it or not, it has a way of getting into us. And it kind of fuels our responses, and we need to be aware of that. We need to notice it and bring a bit of curiosity to it and look at what the Jesus way is. Like Zacchaeus is a brilliant example of that kind of playful approach. Jesus didn't look at him and say, you're halfway up a tree. What are you doing up there? That's not what we do. That's not safe. And I will not be speaking to you until you come down and stand in the place that we know is acceptable. When you're doing that, I'll give you some attention. He didn't do that. He just went up to him where he was and said, let's have tea. There's a real kind of acceptance, which is the second part of taste, of meeting him where he is, and kind of seeing him as he is. Jesus was playful in how he approached people and accepting of.
And I think we miss that sometimes when we read the Gospels. We miss the playful. It's hard to know if it's humour or if we're missing it in culture, but You read these interactions, you're like, is he teasing her? I don't know. Like, because we don't expect him to be playful. I think we have this idea of Jesus being quite serious and solemn. But actually, I think he does do this playful approach quite regularly with people, and we don't always know how to read it into scripture or imagine it.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Yeah. So we've got playful, we've got acceptance.
Sorry, yeah, we were on playfulness, acceptance. Curiosity is the C, and that kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier. What is going on here? Can we bring some curiosity to behaviour that we're seeing? Can we remember to ask God about it? Remember that we can have insight through the Holy Spirit and just really kind of not see behaviour for what it is, but see what's underlying and where it's coming from. And then E is empathy, which is a real witness. It's sitting with. Literally, when you break it down, it means to be with someone in their pain. So it's sitting with someone in the space that they're in, not kind of a bit of sympathy and putting a silver lining on it. Brene Brown, there's a brilliant clip on YouTube. Someone's put an animation to her little clip on the difference between sympathy and empathy. And how we can kind of sit with someone. And it's back to that quote, if we can see a child and see behaviour as a child that is struggling, and as opposed to someone that needs to be disciplined in a punitive way, if we can sit with it and just see the struggle that is coming on, that is being communicated through that behaviour, and we bring some curiosity to what it is, we kind of sit with and make space for, and Jesus is brilliant at that in every interaction. I love his thing with the blind man of, what do you want me to do for you? It's obvious in so many ways, but he just really brings curiosity to it and sits with and empowers that person's voice to be heard.
It's really good. So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, this is so great, but it sounds very time consuming and very kind of bespoke, sitting down with a kid, having one-on-ones with them. How does this scale? So assuming that we're blessed enough to have, say, 20 children in a mixed age group, or maybe 10 of them or whatever, and a few of them, or maybe only one is dysregulated today, or maybe there's a few of them playing off of each other, because that happens. One of them gets noisy and agitated and then winds the other one up. Like, what can we do for the whole group that helps? And it helps everybody, not just those who are, as you say, experiencing trauma. But is there a scalable sort of tactic for this?
Yes. So I'm aware it can all sound really idealistic, and I'm really passionate about journeying on with kids, and I just get really excited about it. But it is a really practical approach. And for me, it's also an approach that is not labour intensive. I think that's the big fear from lots of people. But actually, when we do this well, and we kind of preempt some of the challenges that children can experience when we understand what trauma is, and when we understand kind of neurodiversity and what is happening for our children with sensory processing difficulties, when we preempt those, what we end up having are far fewer things of children just being dysregulated, we say, kind of just in a not right state, or kind of struggling with their behaviour, or showing us through their behaviour that they're struggling. So it actually is less work, I think, with some really tiny tweaks that can help. So I have in the session that we do so I've got a few training sessions, either in the PACE session or the other session on Brilliant Brain, understanding our children's brains. I use a tool called the Star of Safety, just as a kind of first step, like how do we create spaces that feel safe for the children? Because we are usually very good at kind of making sure that there's not a wire trailing and there's not a box of books that's about to fall on a child's head, like physically looking at the physical safety of the space. But we need to be just as aware of the physical, of the emotional safety, of the felt safety of each child in the room. So the Star of Safety is a good kind of into that. So it stands, I'm not going to remember the tool that I wrote, it stands for S for structure. So are we really clear with what is happening? So for children that have experienced trauma, a good way to help them, and for children with neurodiversity, and this is what I love about this stuff, like if we get it right, it just hits so many children. Some kids are not that bothered, but by having structure in place, it's not going to cause them difficulty. But a great swathe of children will be immediately helped, so it feels like a no-brainer. Why would you not do this? So letting children know what is going to happen and when it's going to take place, because then they're not sitting in this fear of the unknown. What might come next? Will I like it? Will I enjoy it? Will I feel safe? Will it be okay? Will it be comfortable for me? They don't have to do that when they know what's coming. So it feels like such a tiny thing to do, but it can make such a massive difference to so many of our children. So having good structure, so a good visual timetable. I know you guys at Roots have got a really good look already with the cards.
Here's one I made earlier.
So just having them out is that this is what our time together is going to look like. And then don't just stick it up and ignore it, like come back to it. So when the top activity has been done, we're going to take it off. Kids aren't always good at tracing down and working out where they are in the program. So just keep it easy by what we're doing is always the top one. So kind of coming back to that visual timetable. So structure, transition. So if we are switching from one activity to another, giving really good warning for that. So, we've got 5 minutes left of craft time. If you've got children for whom you notice that this is particularly challenging for, then kind of visual sand timers for a 5-minute warning mean they can see the sand dripping down, and so they know. Some children just get really engrossed in what they are doing, and so when you suddenly switch it up and ready for it, they're out of control and that doesn't feel safe. So routine is the R. Coming back, I will think of the A. Routine is kind of, I think in children's work we are not good at this because I think we put something on ourselves that says we need to be innovative. Like we've always got to ring the changes. We've got to find the next new game, or, we can't do this because we did it last week. But actually, our children, like, are often creatures of habit. They love things that can continually happen. They love to know that we do craft time and then we always get juice, because that helps them feel safe because they're kind of in the space and they know how it works. And so that kind of routine, don't feel like you continually need to ring the changes and be all singing and all dancing. Routine can be really, really helpful. And A, I remembered, is anchor. So how do we help our children anchor in the space? So we've talked a little bit about that with kind of continuity. That's not always possible when your volunteers change up. But actually, can we have similar approaches even when the team is not the same? So that kind of it doesn't feel like they have to get used to 4 different spaces because they have 4 different volunteer teams each week. How do we help them to anchor in where they're at? And sometimes a kind of transit for children that really struggle and don't want to leave parents, can we help them anchor and feel safe by having a kind of a safe thing from home, like a toy or those little pocket hugs are a really good thing that just sit, that mum's given you because you know that it's okay. She's kind of with you and it's that like anchored in the space that makes it feel. But yeah, just anchoring within it. Does that make sense?
That's really good. Yeah. So is the
anchoring slightly different?
Is the anchoring about anchoring to a person? I guess it's not, because you were talking about the pocket hugs, but it's a way to feel connected in the space. Is that what you're how you're defining anchoring?
Like lots of different things, can't it? But how to even just like remembering children's names like helps them feel seen and hooked into the space, like I'm welcome here, or structure really helps with anchoring. So if they know where they're coming to when they walk through the door, or is there always a welcoming activity so that they're not in this unstructured space while they wait for everyone to gather? Is there something that means they can come in and get on with it straight away because they're anchoring then into where they are?
And so if you've got a new child this is their first Sunday ever coming, they're not going to know the structure, the transitions, they're not going to feel anchored, and they're not going to know the routine. So that's like high levels of anxiety, especially if you've got sort of a trauma background. Are there sort of a power version of it to help a new child really connect in, that you would do if somebody rocks up brand new?
Yeah, so that's why your visual timetable is so brilliant, because it's there immediately, isn't it? So not just expecting someone to join in, but like a kind of welcome and this is what this space looks like, and this is what our program is going to be. And right now we sit and we do colouring, and then at this point we're going to... So just a kind of quick overview of what it looks like. And then I guess the other thing that doesn't really fit in with any of the star things, but just is always a good one to mention for safety and felt safety. I guess it kind of comes into anchoring around where they're positioned, is where children are allowed to sit. So for children that have experienced trauma, those children will often be alert. They will always be alert to the possibility of danger, because basically the world has taught them, their experience has taught them that the world was not safe. And so they will always be looking for it. I kind of call them the meerkats. You see them continually like scanning around the area. They're looking for it. They're always on kind of high alert, ready. And so for those children sitting at the front in the middle, when there's a whole lot going on behind them that they can't see, doesn't help them feel safe. So a kind of anchoring for them is noticing that they're hugging the wall. And I think sometimes we have this thing in us where we just want everyone to join in, but joining in means that they're right in the thick of it and they're right in the centre. But if we can bring some curiosity for seeing what's going on and kind of really prioritise felt safety, just asking that question. We normally sit here, do you feel safer? Does this make you feel safer? So, yeah, that's totally okay. I can sit with you in this space.
That's good.
As they kind of hug the wall.
I think some adults will recognise their own behaviour now. They're like, oh, that's why I sit on the back row of church.
I'm usually on the back row so that no one sees that I'm being naughty.
There is that too, isn't there? But I think, some kids with sensory challenges will not sit in the circle or near the front because it's noisier. So whether they're doing it because they're self-aware or whether they're just sort of doing it intuitively, I think, again, not seeing it as a judgment on your own content or anything like that, but actually just seeing this as this is this child getting what they need here, which is safety and space to process. And it's, I think the challenge we can feel is like, well, if I let them sit over here, then everybody else won't want to sit in the circle and listen to the story. And so how do you communicate? Can you give us some wording on how you communicate to the rest of the group in a way that keeps the whole group going forward, but allows the space for other people to do what they need to do?
Yeah. So I think it's really important that what I'm not talking about is just a free-for-all and anyone can do whatever they want, because that isn't safe. That doesn't feel safe to anyone. Actually, that whole kind of star of safety of setting up the space is often more about containment than it is just about run around and do whatever you want, because actually that containment is really important. That's often what helps children feel safe. Where in the I was just reading about this morning in the Bible, just that whole thing about God hemming us in. The Bible verse talks about you hem me in and you place your hand on me. And I was like, wow, that is such a beautiful, like scriptural representation of what we're talking about with a trauma-informed approach. That we're contained and then we're kind of weighted in. That kind of like, we use weighted blankets quite often for children that just don't feel grounded, they don't feel safe, they don't feel contained, just to help them feel kind of safe and in this space, which is just that beautiful word. So that containment is so important. So we're not talking about anyone can do whatever they want. I think choice is a really important thing, and in it, empowerment. I mean, that is the heart of the gospel, isn't it? That we have choice, and often we don't give our children much choice. But that's not choice as in do 17 different things and then we've got everyone running around and no one knows what they're doing. Would you like to sit here or do you feel safer sat over here? It's that kind of like fixed choices in an entertainment thing. So definitely boundaries and containing the space is really important. We're not talking about a free-for-all, which I think is how people sometimes hear.
We go from one extreme to the other, don't we?
Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Can you give us like a quick tip on, say you've got a really dysregulated group, would you do something to like help everybody get centered and grounded? And before you start, say you've had them all doing various activities and you want to get them all together, maybe for a Bible story or something, what would you do to help bring some regulation?
Yeah, so I've got a whole, and it's actually a day's training on sensory processing, because I just think it's so important, but there's also a lot to unpack and understand. I guess my frustration with sensory processing is I've sat in a lot of sensory processing training and I've heard it from a kind of trauma awareness perspective, and I've heard it from a kind of kind of neurodiversity and sensory processing, and it's almost like what is being said is exactly the same, but it's like it's in two different languages, which just doesn't help us, does it? When we kind of are, and I think that's the problem with a lot of this stuff, is it's almost information overload. And when you've got that, it's really hard to know, like, where do we start? And so the kind of sensory processing day, I hope, just really breaks it all down and gets rid of the kind of fear around it and just helps us unpick it and journey well. So it is a day. So to say it in about 30 seconds is challenging. However,
Sorry.
I would say my top tips, like my headline things that I think anyone could do and everyone should do almost.
Yeah.
Is, so the top one is breathing. So breathing is just, I mean, obviously breathing is amazing, like it keeps us alive, but beyond the kind of just breathing in and out, deep breathing has been shown to have so many wider benefits, like holistically for your health, like helps blood pressure, it helps all kinds of things. But when we breathe deeply, basically what we do is tell our bodies that we are safe. Because when we're not safe, adrenaline kicks in, we breathe shallow and our bodies go into what's called fight, flight, freeze response, which we haven't got time to. That's it's basically getting us ready to face that danger. And so when we breathe deeply and slowly, we tell our bodies we're safe, we're okay. So it's an amazing thing. And I on the website, I've got loads of breathing activities that you can try with children. But my absolute favourite is breathing prayers, because I think when we bring deep breathing with all of its benefits that we now understand and know about and scripture together, like it's a no-brainer and you've just got this winning combo. So I just like to use a really simple Bible passage. So be still and know that I am God is like my personal favourite that I use, where the first part of it, as I think it in my head, I take a deep breath in and then breathe out as I say the second part of it. And I just do that 3 times. I use that throughout the day myself before I go into a meeting that I think might be challenging, or when I can notice that my day feels like it's getting a bit stressful, just that kind of simple breathing prayer. But we're doing tiny prayers within our programs often with our children. So why not just combine that with a little bit of deep breathing? And actually, deep breathing is a really good technique when a child is dysregulated, when they've really kind of flipped their lid and they're not happy. But we can't teach a child that when they are in that space. So the more we can build breathing into our programs, what we also do is kind of arm our kids with a tool in their back pocket that we can then draw out when they're really struggling, that will help them feel calm and safe when it's needed. So it's just a no-brainer. So deep breathing I would definitely do. And then the other thing is kind of deep pressure. Basically, when we are in the womb, we learn 2 things that help us feel safe. Like, we learn that we're safe when we feel like deep pressure, like we're in this tiny contained space, and kind of rhythmic rocking. When I have my girls, you definitely notice when you're pregnant that when you're moving, things are quite quiet, and it's when you're still and trying to go to sleep that everything gets much
off.
more active. But it's because that rhythmic rocking is really soothing. But so is the deep pressure that we learn in that space. And so tiny little deep pressure activities with our kids throughout the time, it can be really, really helpful just to kind of get their bodies ready to listen to the story, or, to just be in a kind of quieter space. So like a self-hug, I do one called a hookup. There's lots of things, but just tiny little, how do we get them to have a good squeeze? Rainbow breathing. I'm trying to think of one I can describe verbally rather than needing to show you. Rainbow breathing is a really good one. So I just get the children to curl up into a tiny, tiny ball. That's the deep pressure. And then to stretch up high as they can as they take a deep, deep breath in. And then to open their arms like a big rainbow as they breathe out. So that way you get deep pressure and you get breathing. And their bodies feel safer and they're ready to engage with what you're doing.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you. I know that I have asked you a number of times to summarize a whole day's worth of training into 30 seconds or 5 minutes to do. Well, you're a wealth of knowledge. And so how can people get you to come and train their churches, their volunteers? Do you do webinars? Do you come and do face-to-face? Tell us more about what you do. Links to the resources Lisa mentioned and her website are all in the show notes. Roots Children and Youth Resource offer a familiar structure each week that prioritises relationship over programme and uses different spiritual styles in the course of each session. so everyone can engage and participate. There's multi-sensory input and fun, tried and true games and activities with enough variety to bring engagement, but not so much it's stressful. There's plenty of opportunity to connect, chat, pray, worship and journey with children. And we pull together all the templates, craft ideas, visuals and prompts so you and your volunteers can focus on relationships and what God is up to in your group. Our flexible and reliable structure is this. First, there's a gather, which includes an icebreaker and a prayer, then share the word, a creative way to open scripture together. Explore and Respond has loads of games and activities, prayers and ways to engage with the theme. And Go with God is a way to apply faith and learning to our lives as we go home. Our content offers the same theme and Bible passage differentiated over 3 age groups, under 5s, children and youth. So if you've got a smaller group or combined ages, or you've got some additional needs you're looking to support, you can easily flip over the page or scroll on to have more ideas to differentiate the lesson. Lisa mentioned a visual timetable to help with structure and transitions.
Oh, yes. So I have got like a whole training offer that's available on the website. Most of it I can very happy to come and do in person. I can kind of bespoke it up. So if there's a particular thing that's going on for you, then we can kind of look at bringing different elements together. But I can also deliver those as online webinars as well, like in person, and we'll break it down into groups, the joy of technology that we can now. And then the sensory processing day is a day's training, and that is just in person because of the nature of it.
As you just demonstrated, it's very hard to teach people to do some of these things through a screen.
So we kind of journey ourselves. We feel what it feels like. We look at different things like how we can use sensory stories. So it's a very practical day. Get out lots of equipment, wobble chairs and all kinds of different things just to see what it feels like. So yeah, that's there.
It sounds
I've
so
also
good.
got like a Senko service. So if you are sat thinking, but what about this child and what does it look like in this space? Then there's a kind of Senko service where you can just kind of get access to me, and we'll have one-to-ones each half term and just talk about the needs of your group. So yeah, it's all on the website.
Amazing. So your website is wonderfulme.org.uk, and people can go on there and find things, and we'll put links as well to all the sort of worksheets and stuff that Lisa has mentioned so that you can get a visual on what we're describing.
Yeah. There's loads of free resources. My husband keeps joking that I'm putting the free into freelance because it's just good stuff, and I'm like, people just need it. So there's loads and loads of free resources on the website.
Well, nobody can doubt your heart for us to do a better job at this as a church. And I'm just encouraged, and I feel like I've learned some things. Hoping other people feel that way as well. So do get in touch with Lisa if she can come and do some training for your church or a group of churches or a diocese or something like that, because that would be a great use of our time and help us to love so many children and be the hope that they need through the church. So thank you, Lisa, for your time. It's been brilliant.
It's been fun.
If you'd like to purchase a visual timetable for your churches, you can head to rootsforchurches.com/VT for visual timetable. We have a physical card pack we can post to you, or a digital copy which you can print and laminate yourself at any large size. Or you can use them on your PowerPoint slides. Thanks again for listening, and if you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and share it with a colleague or friend. Together, we can grow.